Good Yontif. It's been 726 days since October 7th, and so many in Israel and the Jewish world continue to be unmoored. Over the last year, I've spoken to a number of you struggling to make sense of what's happening in Israel, struggling from a place of grief for the losses of October 7th and the plight of the 48 still held in captivity, but struggling also because of the complexity of the moment. Israel was heinously victimized, and there are unimaginable images of Gazan hunger and devastation on our screens. Some days we're uncertain about the accuracy of news and photos from the region, and some of us are confused about how to navigate our general support of Israel if we disagree with the values of Prime Minister Netanyahu and his extreme right-wing coalition. I'm struggling too. I'm concerned because Israel's security remains threatened by Iran and its satellites, including Hamas. I'm regularly worried about Israeli friends and colleagues, especially after news like the recent Jerusalem bus stop shooting. And I pray for the brave IDF soldiers I have indirect connections to, the relatives of Israeli congregants, and Chayalim Bodedim, diaspora-born lone soldiers who made Aliyah to serve in the army, several of whom are close friends of my children or the precious kids of American colleagues. Like you, I've been trying to find wisdom to navigate the complexity of this moment. There are no easy answers, of course, but I wanted to share a framework this morning that will enable us to more thoughtfully navigate shifting events in Israel and the Middle East. The word I keep returning to is entanglement. Whether we like it or not, American Jews are entangled with the events of the Middle East generally, and more specifically, Israelis and all Jews are entangled with the Palestinians. In an interconnected world where anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism have gone global, what goes on there touches us here, sometimes deeply and personally. Entanglement isn't just a relational phenomenon, it's also a concept from quantum physics. In that context, Stephen Witt describes it as, quote, "Imagine that you and a friend flip two entangled quarters. The outcome of the flips is determined only when you peek at the coins. If you inspect your quarter and see that it came up heads, then your friends will come up tails. This property holds true no matter how far you travel from each other. If you were to travel all the way to Jupiter, your friend's quarter would instantaneously reveal the opposite result." This is science speak for fates being so deeply tied that by definition, what happens to one impacts the other. We see that kind of entanglement in Torah itself. In Genesis 44:30, Judah describes the unique relationship between his brother Benjamin and his father Jacob with these words, "V'nafsho kishura benafsho." Benjamin's soul is wholly bound up with Jacob's, and vice versa. The fate of one cannot be factored out of the fate of the other. Regardless of one's personal Israel politics, we acknowledge today that the fate of the Jewish state is inexorably tied up with the fate of the Palestinians. How can we try to make sense of this entanglement in the present moment? To be entangled is neither good nor bad. It just is part of the on-the-ground reality of the Middle East. We are entangled religiously because Jews and Muslims have a common monotheistic origin in the story of Abraham. We are entangled linguistically because Hebrew and Arabic share roots and words in common. We are entangled historically because Jews and Arabs relied on the same Western powers to resolve questions about sharing the land in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And we are entangled economically when the Israeli economy relies on Palestinian day laborers for a segment of the Israeli job market. Let me ask you to take just a moment to take your own internal temperature about where you stand on Israel and Palestinian questions today. How entangled are you with what is going on in the Middle East? Rabbi Daniel Hartman directs the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, an important pluralistic Jewish think tank that identifies as liberal Zionist. Rabbi Hartman teaches that we can think about contemporary Zionist identity along two axes. One that measures commitment to Israel as a Jewish state, and one that measures the intensity of wrestling with the question of competing obligations to Israelis and Palestinians. Hartman uses the term troubled with instead of wrestling with, but I want to make sure we understand that he doesn't mean troubled in the archaic mental health sense of the word. He means troubled in the moral reckoning sense of the term. Each of us could plot ourselves along these two axes, and we would then wind up in one of Hartman's four overarching categories. His first category is called untroubled, uncommitted. These are Jews disconnected from Zionist claims about the need for a Jewish state. These are also people untroubled about competing obligations to Israelis and Palestinians, which is to say, this group is primarily concerned about the Palestinians. Then there are the untroubled committed. These are Jews deeply committed to Zionism, and they are untroubled or not compelled to grapple with competing obligations to Israelis and Palestinians. That is to say, the second group is primarily concerned with Israeli Jews. And Hartman indicates two additional categories for those who are actively troubled and conflicted about the conflict. Hartman designates a third group as troubled, uncommitted. These are Jews who are uncommitted. They come from a place of disconnect with Israel and Zionism, but who still grapple with how Israelis and Palestinians ought to be relating to one another, and how we're called to relate to both. And finally, the troubled committed. These are the Jews who are deeply committed to Zionism, but are nonetheless unresolved about the competing moral claims raised by the conflict and the entangled ways Palestinians and Israelis affect each other. Given that Israelis and Palestinians are fundamentally entangled, and as we, as a result, are entangled with them, I find it telling that our Jewish tradition, and especially this day of Yom Kippur itself, is saturated with teachings about the virtue of wrestling with the hardest issues. There's something quintessentially Jewish about grappling with complex moral questions, especially when there are no easy answers. No matter where you find yourself on these axes, I invite you to consider using this lens to try to make sense of the complexity of the current situation. The locus classicus for the general Jewish value of being morally troubled is found in Genesis 32:29. There, Jacob wrestles with the mysterious angel and wins for himself and the Jewish people the name Yisrael, which means one who wrestles or grapples with God. We are Yisrael. We are wrestlers. To morally wrestle is not easy. For some, it's so difficult that it's akin to emotional suffering. If you are so distressed by the news out of Israel and the Middle East that you experience shades of depression or sadness, this could be you. Thus the psalmist writes, I am weary with groaning. Every night I drench my bed, I melt my couch in tears. The biblical author imagines us so overwhelmed with moral questions that we cry ourselves to sleep at night. And the rabbis of the Midrash, commenting on that verse, honor the struggle, imagining the tears as a poignant prayer to God that is clearly heard in heaven. The 20th century philosopher, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, put it this way: the Jewish ideal of religious personality is not the harmonious individual, but rather the torn soul and the shattered spirit. According to Soloveitchik, the essence of our Jewishness is our torn souls and shattered spirits because we care so deeply about treating others justly. These ideas are particularly brought to life in the context of Yom Kippur. This afternoon, we will once again read from the book of Jonah. It is a complicated story about a prophet who flees from God and responsibility. My teacher, Professor Viva Zornberg, notes that Jonah's name means dove in Hebrew. Many commentators over the centuries have compared Jonah to a bird that flies away. But Zornberg adds that meaning itself is fleeing in the text. She writes that we read Jonah on Yom Kippur because the story in all its enigmatic force is never to be finally decoded, its mystery resolved. She teaches that, like moral conundrums, stories don't always yield easy answers. That we read this story on this day reminds us of the inherent Jewish virtue of grappling. The most important questions in life don't have easy answers. It's not just okay to be troubled, it's that we ought to be troubled. That notion is echoed in Psalm 130, a text we recite throughout this holiday season. The psalm opens with the memorable line, "From my very depths I cry out to you." Bible scholar Robert Alter writes of this verse, generations of readers have responded to the archetypal starkness. The speaker, from the darkness of profound despair, calls out to God. And Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz adds that the Hebrew, mima'amakim, out of the depths, has a twofold meaning. I feel like someone thrust into a deep pit, and I'm calling from the innermost depths of my heart. This Yom Kippur psalm reminds us that we utter our most authentic prayers when we make ourselves vulnerable to the moral struggles of our lives. It is in those moments that we have the capacity to speak from the innermost depths of our hearts. 2 years after October 7th, and Israelis, and so many of us, still find ourselves calling out to God from those innermost depths, even as we struggle to make sense of our obligations to the Palestinians who hold a different narrative. That grief and entanglement is represented by kalaniot, the iconic red anemones that bloom in the desert surrounding the kibbutzim hit hardest on October 7th. The flowers are a beloved symbol of Israel and Israelis' connection to the land. For 2 decades, the Spring Flower Festival, Darom Adom, the Scarlet Red of the South, was a huge driver of tourism to that part of Israel. Vered Libstein, the founder of the festival, reflected on the first bloom after October 7th, noting, "On one side, it's hard, given the blood-colored flower petals and the loss they represent. But on the other side, it just proves to us that life is stronger than everything, and it renews itself, and we'll need to find the strength to renew ourselves as well." The red anemone is itself entangled because it's also called Shakayik al-Numan. It's also a symbol for Palestinians' connection to the land. The flower contains black, white, red, and green, the colors of the Palestinian flag. For both peoples, the flower symbolizes resilience. Israelis and Palestinians aim to thrive in the desert just like the red anemone. Maybe the lesson of Yom Kippur isn't that we have to resolve who can claim the red anemone. Instead, we're called to grapple with both claims because our futures are entangled and tied up together. We can't dismiss the other just because they're not our own. To be entangled and to be morally troubled by that entanglement is to be a Jew and a Zionist on Yom Kippur. Some of us are familiar with the name Rachel Goldberg Polin. Her son Hirsch was horrifically abducted from the Nova Festival on October 7th and was heartlessly murdered by Hamas in August of 2024. Since his abduction, Rachel has been one of the most outspoken advocates on behalf of the hostages and their families. In the midst of her nightmare after Hirsch was kidnapped, Rachel courageously wrote a poem called "One Tiny Seed," which was recently published in a landmark anthology of Israeli poetry since October 7th. I'm not sure if she had Kalaniot specifically in mind, but her words remind us of the hope that comes when we acknowledge all the ways we're entangled, even in as simple an act as planting a seed. She opens her poem with these words. There's a Yiddish lullaby that says, "Your mother will cry 1,000 tears before you grow up to be a man." I have cried 1,000,000 tears in the last 67 days. We all have. And I know, way over there, there's another woman who looks just like me, because we're all so very similar. She has also been crying all those tears. Our sea of tears, they all taste the same. Can we take them? Can we gather them up and remove the salt and then pour them over our desert of despair and plant one tiny seed, a seed that is wrapped in fear, trauma, pain, and hope, and see what grows? May the hostages be returned as speedily as possible. May Hirsch's memory live on to be for a blessing. May this be the year when seeds can be planted for a just and lasting peace. Let us say together,
Amen. We pray for peace in Israel with the words of Shir LaShalom.